Welcome back to Half Past Capitalism. I'm here with Nav Kaur, who is a good friend and also a member of the Sikh community, a teacher, an anti-colonial feminist, an educator, and a campaigner. We work together in the Courage Coalition, among other things, Friends of Public Services as well. And Nav is coming to us live from Treaty 7 territory in the belly of the petrocapital beast, Alberta. The Calgary is the actual place. Welcome, Nav.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for organizing this.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. So I want to talk about, I guess the sort of nominal theme of this chat is childcare. But I generally like to start with the question: what was your most recent experience of capitalism? Just to sort of ground things. But yeah, I'm just curious. Like, what was the last time, just in your sort of daily life, that you were like, oh, I live in a capitalist economy?
Late last night, I went on a grocery run. So just like at 8 o'clock or whatever, went to Safeway here, which I used to work at Safeway actually back in high school. So for many years, so it's always a bit nostalgic and familiar no matter where I am. Safeways all look the same. But I was with a friend of mine that we're sort of cohort living together with. And there was only one till open, and I was a cashier for a long time. And in her frustration, just expressing like, how can they only have one till open? And I just slowly glanced at how the self-checkout area keeps growing, and we're not noticing that. But of course, they only have one till because it's the labor, right? They want us to do that labor and check ourselves out. And again, it was just a little hard to watch, just because being part of Safeway, it's unionized work, right? And just knowing that workers are being squeezed again, and in general, just being in a grocery store and being like, this is an illusion of choice. There's like 5 actual companies that we're shopping with. But that was just her in her frustration, and me thinking, it's capitalism. Like, of course they're not hiring, they're not valuing the labor, right? And they're in fact, they're putting that onto us. Like, now we're also doing checkout. I was like, I was getting paid to do checkout, like now they want the consumer to do it again, right? And I mean, we feel that every day, right?
Us and robots.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So that was just like an acute every day, here it is again, just capitalism making us do the work, and right, just in that cycle. So
sure. So wages for self-checkout, is that a demand?
What's that, sir?
I was just thinking of wages for housework and wages for self-checkout.
Totally, discount. Hey, if I'm doing the self-checkout, like, pay me a half an hour's salary that you would, but preferably pay a unionized staff member, pay an employee that has those protections. And yeah,
that would be preferable, wouldn't it? Yeah. Cool. So yeah, I wanted to chat with you about childcare, as I said. And so you're an early childhood educator, and you've also started sort of I guess a daycare, or you were part of a daycare at one point. Tell me about those experiences, and sort of in the context of, I don't know.
Yeah.
Late capitalism and being in the middle of the the petro-industrial complex.
Yeah. Well, I'll step back. I'll kind of like sort of give some context. Maybe I think I'm part of a generation, a second generation of labor, of racialized women that are from the Commonwealth, that were brought in the 60s and 70s. So a lot of Black and brown women, part of the Commonwealth, were brought into Canada to do childcare, nannies and other types of labor, that child rearing, really, for the sake of, white feminism, getting a seat at the table so that they could go to work, child care goes on. So my mom actually, I was raised in daycares. My mom worked in daycares. My entire community, like every woman I know I grew up with, Punjabi women, all working and owning daycares. Eventually in Alberta, they've become privatized, right? So in the mid 80s, there was a move to privatize childcare centers. And so that's where a large, again, portion of racialized women in Alberta have become business owners, really, and hiring other racialized women to do this work. And so I've opened numerous daycares. I, became a teacher, and, I do the policies. It's become highly sort of administrative. We could sort of get into that, but yeah, I think I'm part of a large portion of our community that, who are connected to this whole industry, really, right? And the changes we've seen over the last 20 years. So right now, I work as a consultant and I support daycares that, frankly speaking, just there's a lot of administration behind them, and other just strategies to support them. And obviously, coming from immigrant background, I can talk to these women. A lot of them are highly trained principals and superintendents from other countries, and they're coming into the Canadian lines, and often, I mean, we could get into how childcare labor is treated and considered in progressive movements. I think I have a very specific bent on that. That's not maybe heard in progressive circles, just because of my experience running them. And yeah, it's a business. So I guess I'm an entrepreneur, as they love to call me here in the heartland of the neocons. But yeah.
And so you mentioned the sort of there's a racial dynamic there in terms of racialized women in particular being sort of in this sort of childcare sector while it's being privatized. Can you tell me a bit more about that? Like what are the sort of threads of that history that led to that particular division of labor?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could go back into the policy. I haven't done the deep research. It's just the experience that I've seen in our communities. But, there was definitely, when you look at the migration and who was allowed to immigrate back in the 60s and 70s on the point system in Canada, a lot of it was like women from the Caribbean, a lot of Indian women that were sort of vetted, could speak English, etc. And so they came initially without their families to do a lot of this caregiving work, a lot of live-in nannies. Fast forward, in the 80s, in Alberta now, I can't speak across the country, but in Alberta, there was a shift to privatize these places. And so some of the women were able to organize and own the daycares and run the daycares. And then so they're hiring more people, obviously creating that community, right? Coming from different cultures, there's a child rearing, there's philosophies and deep philosophy, epistemic and ontological ways of being with children that come from our communities. And so I think racialized women from, Punjabi women and all sorts of other ethnic groups, I guess, that were able to come here, they've created these communities really of labor, childcare labor, that are the ones at the daycares receiving your children, and and in this really weird tight space between government policy and then and being service providers for our most vulnerable, our most precious community members. And I think that's there. We could talk more about sort of movements towards universal childcare and what I've sort of seen in that. But that's what I've seen. And I think there's a hierarchy of labor, right? So when you privatize things, you have owners and workers and employees. And I've seen a lot of lateral violence. I've seen a lot of racialized women who now owning and are those business owners, right? Exploiting the labor of, their peers, really, of their own community members. And I'm yet to see unionized workspaces, cooperative. And I mean, we've spoken about this. This is like a dream of mine as a policy, the person that helps set up the daycares or brings the daycares up to standard or whatever. Like, I would love to work with the workers doing that grassroots and really restructuring the way in which we host childcare spaces, right? And where the power is really back to the women that are doing this day-to-day labor. So.
Yeah, I wanted to pick up on a sort of a thread earlier in what you said, which is about there's sort of there's a real, seems like there's a cultural component to having a strong idea of what it is to care for children, what it is to care for elderly people, and so on. That is obviously a part of why racialized women in that generation and obviously that continues. Maybe the demographics have shifted or the countries that they come from have shifted, but it seems like there's there's a strong sort of pre-existing cultural practice that's being sort of, you know, put into service, taking care of, you know, I guess mostly white people's kids, and or their parents or grandparents or whatever. So I'm curious how, just in your experience, how capitalism, or sort of being in this sort of like, you know, not taking care of your own kids or not taking care of your own grandparents, and then doing that for a wage, how is capitalism and the sort of pressures shaping the content of what goes into childcare?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's all education spaces. You know, there's education policy. There's a lot of policies written, a lot of good intentions written by folks that maybe that have university degrees and have never actually done the work. And so what we see often is a fear really of a lot of the women that are doing the work being sort of separate from the policy and the intention of the policy. And oftentimes the policies are written around risk mitigation, right? We're living in capitalism. So truly that's really what it's all about. And so there's no even consideration that the women that are taking care of our children in these centers have knowledge, right? That they have anything to add to policy. In fact, they are just the recipients. They need to be compliant. And that, I mean, in progressive circles, the ones that you see, you know, we want universal childcare. Oftentimes we're talking about fees and that it's a fees problem, and that the labor is getting paid. I mean, frankly, they're not getting paid enough. They don't have the protections they need in most cases. But, you know, we don't really talk about the implication that capitalism has on space. And that's really what I push back on. A lot of times it's an entry spot for a lot of progressive folks that want, you know, $25, you know, universal childcare, which is, we could talk about that. It's kind of a side thing, but we're really not critiquing, you know, if you're paying $20,000 in rent and you're paying $20,000 in wages, and we want the government to subsidize these spaces. Well, a majority of that subsidy is going to landlords. And so when we talk about the shrinking commons and we talk about a public good space, very specifically, healthy, good spaces for our children must be, right, integrated into that. And, you know, we could talk about nonprofits stepping in also, and, you know, they get, you know, there's subsidies for the rent. So rent in general, we need to speak about landlords and space and rent and all of that, and the government really prioritizing free space, really good quality, you know, construction and like the actual place and space that we have these spaces in. And the rent, of course, is like it's retail rent, right? So a majority of your fees are going to the rent, and we don't talk about that in progressive circles around this. And so that's sort of, you know, it's all tangled up. And then nonprofits, I mean, we know that nonprofits is in the childcare industry is so interesting. So for me, I mean, yeah, eventually my mom was able to buy a daycare, and she was the owner. And so that's where a lot of my management and working with the staff and that experience started coming in as an older person with that experience. And, you know, and we really consider ourselves like a mom and pop shop. Like we know every child, right? We're a family going there every day for 12 hours a day. And we know every kid, we know every family. And what I've seen over the last decade is this growth, this explosion of, well, there's international businesses that are just investing in childcare. That's another story. But with nonprofits, there's what I've seen is an exploitation of staff and labor again. So yes, if you have an owner and they're exploiting staff, I don't want to minimize that. That happens. But with nonprofits, it's sort of this, there's no direct accountability, right? You have this amorphous blob of a board, and oftentimes they're using temporary foreign workers, and they don't mind the turnover, right? And when we're talking again about child rearing and those relationships and, you know, child development, really healthy child development and healthy attachment in our children, you know, having stable staff that are well supported, you know, they're not worried about buying glasses for their own kids, right? They have all of the benefits they need. They have the ability to continually go to school and, you know what I mean, get what they need to be able to do their job in a healthy way and be supported. I mean, I'm not seeing that in the nonprofit sector either. So I think progressive organizers who are working on these campaigns, there are some really deep-seated issues that, you know, we kind of can gloss over, because it's easier to just say we need universal childcare. Yeah. So does that mean nonprofits? Because nonprofits, who's talking about the labor and protecting the people actually doing this work? And unfortunately, I find that often the people doing the progressive campaigning around this stuff are not, they're well-intentioned parents who are often very educated, and again, maybe they appreciate the staff, but then they're like, well, we pay too much for daycare. And again, that real solidarity is just not there. There is no bridge there. And I've noticed that in often all these policy conferences and the national groups, and it's just a conversation that needs to be broken through, and it's a chasm, really, I feel sometimes.
And so this is really, there's a whole bunch that you just said, so I'm going to try and recap for the audience, but also just to organize my own thoughts. But so you have the exploitation on the level of a lot of this money is just going straight to landlords, and then you have exploitation on the level of the management worker relationship, but then you also have exploitation on the level of like nonprofits managing sort of scarce resources that they're getting from whatever funding sources they have, whether that's the parents or the government or foundations or whatever it is, and they're they're managing that, and then they're bringing in temporary foreign workers and burning people out really quickly, whether it's temporary foreign workers or otherwise. They're burning people out with low wages and high workloads in order to maintain whatever service they're mandated to maintain, and then nobody's really accountable because the board is just a bunch of people who are volunteering their time, probably, or getting some honorarium. And then as a result, you have the people who are actually taking care of the kids who are alienated from setting the terms of the actual care that they're providing. So they're not actually able to have any like meaningful input into how that time is structured, like what happens in it. And they have expertise, but they're not able to use it. So I guess I wanted to focus on that. I want to talk about all the other things more too, and also how we can sort of move out. But I feel like that's at the very end of that is like, okay, you have kids who are being taken care of by like people who are alienated from their labor, alienated from their employer, alienated from the kids to a significant degree. So yeah, I guess what I'm curious is like, can you paint a picture of like, just from your sort of on the ground experience, how that could be different? Like, what would it look like if that was even just a little bit different, and we actually had people able to bring not their full selves, because that's ridiculous under capitalism, but something like maybe a few percentage markers more of their self to their work, and engage in a more holistic way with this kind of, in many ways, sort of sacred task of childcare.
Yeah, I mean, going through all of that, I realized like I can give a really simple example. I'll give you a very simple, concrete example that I was part of. So my staff, we have like, when I'm saying there's an intellectual academic type of side that creates the policy that is often sort of oblivious to the day-to-day work, to be, good intentions, but I'm an academic also, so I feel like I can say that. And I remember I was managing a center a few years back, and we had, the newest early child development, activities, but that's great, so you welcome them into the center and they can give suggestions to the staff. And one of the suggestions was giving a fidget toy to young children, like toddlers, on their mat, so like beads essentially. And immediately my staff, they of course never spoke to these people coming in from the university, because there's a hierarchy there, right? So they came to me and they were like, they can't expect us to give a child something they can choke on during their nap time. Like, do they understand our supervision levels, like our ratio levels, that's like pretty inappropriate, whatever. So I heard a lot from the staff. And I gently, being the sort of intermediary person in space and whatever, I sort of gently mentioned that to these academics, and the policy curriculum people, and they really pushed back on that, right? They were like, nope, this is the research and da da da. Great. Fast forward, like even 2 years, like pretty much immediately, that was completely banned. So think about that turnaround, right? You have staff being like, okay, we'll do whatever you say. Like we want to keep our head down and take care of these kids. And you want us to give us beads, we'll give them beads. Okay, we'll do that, whatever. Immediately knowing that it's inappropriate, but not having any, what is the avenue of having input in that policy to say, listen, we're going to push back on that. We live the day to day. No, that's just not, it's a no-go for us. Can we do it in a different way? We understand the principle. Can we, instead of that very heavy top-down approach? And so that's where, you know, informing policy. And then immediately, of course, like 2 years later, if you were caught giving a child beads during their nap time, then as a staffer, then you get pushed, you know what I mean? You'll get your hand slapped. But it's, so a lot of mixed messages, a lot of like experimental theory that often these women are sort of subjected to doing, and there's really no, how do you describe, like, where's their informed consent? Where is their, I mean, and frankly speaking, as someone just spending so much time growing up in daycares, etc., and all the policy work and the management work that I've done, whatever, you know, these women are really the ones that we need to be asking. They truly, I mean, yeah, English is often a barrier, right? And we can talk about the racial hierarchy of labor, and just sort of saying that they're not people that are seen as experts in their field, and yet we entrust them to care for our children every day, 12 hours a day, you know. And so that's, I really just want to focus on their expertise. I mean, a lack of respect of course, in a capitalist system, of their labor, and the I mean, of our value in society. I'm speaking to progressives specifically who want to do better and see better, and be part of these communities, these early childhood communities that we, you know, it is a network, right? How do we support those staff? How do we really see them and give them that power, right, that they feel? But they would never, you know, it's seen as confrontational or whatever. They're never gonna, there's no avenue to speak to this, right? So
I'm curious, I guess. I want to go back up to back toward the material, you know, in a second, but it just one more sort of question about the sort of content, I guess. You know, I feel like I think we understand that like inculcation into a capitalist world and subjectivity and way of being in the world and everything starts basically at birth. Like we are, like, our, you know, yeah, we are sort of taking that in one way or another from birth, and obviously that is extremely powerful in terms of how it narrows the way we see the possibilities of how to do things, or how to but you know, I mean, I understand that on an abstract level, but I'm curious if you have any sort of insights about how that happens in a really, like, concretely, like are there things that you notice as somebody who's worked in childcare and early childhood education, you know, what are the sort of concrete lessons that kids are being sort of taught about how to be in capitalism?
I mean, every day, right? You see it. You put a group of toddlers or preschoolers together, and you'll be amazed, specifically over food, right? When you have a bunch of 3-year-olds or 2.5-year-olds eating together, and when they're chit-chatting, so much of that comes through. And I mean, one of the examples, just off the cuff, I could sort of, you know, it's, you know, tangentially maybe related, but we had children. I mean, oftentimes a lot of childcare staff and immigrants like speak more than English, more than one language. But in a childcare center, we don't, staff don't bring their anything into the space, right? That's essentially deemed inappropriate, I would say, I think, which is it's a huge loss that I feel that we have, right? And we could get into that. But I remember one time there were, you know, these kids, 3 kids who were sitting and having lunch together, and they're drinking water. And 2 of them were from immigrant families. So these 2 little girls spoke 2 different languages, English and then their second language. And then we had one little boy who was unilingual was not exposed to any other languages. And so they're sitting and having water together and having their snack together and chit-chatting. And these two little girls started discussing their second language. So one was saying, oh, this is how we say water in my language. And the other girl is like, oh, that's really interesting. This is how I say water in my language. And they're chit-chatting. And this child, the unilingual child, pretty much had a complete meltdown, right? He was like, water is water is water. There is no, like, stop saying. And I mean, for me, just thinking that what we're really teaching when we, for example, promote this really unilingual, extremely categorized, policy-driven childcare space, and we ask the staff to leave their any holistic sense of being at the door, you know, we have children like that who have complete meltdowns when they realize that water has more than one name. So I'm thinking about that child at 2.5, 3, 4 years old. And if he's already decided, and the authority with which he spoke, right? Water is water is water. Like, stop talking about your second language. Done, right? Extremely, you know, assertive and aggressive, really. And I'm just, again, thinking about, where does that come from? That fear of the other. He's a toddler immediately, you know, and language. And then just thinking, like, everybody around this little boy has a different word for water. And how would that just, you know, terrify him, really, that, like, there is, you know, essentially that there's other paradigms other than the one that he knows and that he might not know, right? And so what are the messages he's receiving? What are the messages that he's receiving? That English is it, right? And very assertively sort of saying, you're not allowed to speak about that. And I think that is part of these spaces, right? That's what we're promoting.
That's incredible. I mean, I guess it never explicitly occurred to me how much of a loss it is to have all these people who speak this probably quite a wide range of languages, and all these kids who, you know, their brains are just absolutely sponges for linguistic structures and different ways of processing meaning, and how much potential there is in I mean, it's just sort of a side note, but it's like, wow, like, yeah. There could be so much I mean, that could be so mind expanding in so many ways for kids to learn different languages, even a little bit, when they're at that age, because they pick it up so quickly.
And even if they don't pick it up, knowing that there's that languages bring a way of understanding the world, and that things have different names. And then, you know, fast forward, we have all these anti-racism marches when people have really decided that there is a singular sort of, you know, but I think really those are the roots, right? When even if a child is at that age is willing to accept, hey, like in Sally's home, she says water in a different way, and like every home might be different, and that's okay, right? We don't have to have a violent reaction towards that, and that they're my neighbors, and right?
Yeah,
and it really starts at that age, at that young of a, you know, so
absolute basics.
Yeah.
The example that comes to mind, which I kind of want to bring it back to the example that you had, but is I was actually in your neck of the woods ish, Heart Lake First Nation, in northern Alberta, and we just happened to be there for treaty days. I was on a sort of a reporting trip, and I just remember like hanging out in the sort of main hall of the you know, First Nation, and seeing these two little, as far as I could tell, you know, settler kids who were there with their, you know, their parents, and they were like playing around, and they like, their dad came in, or like a, you know, older guy came in and said like, hey, can you guys go do this? And they just ignored it, and they were just like playing with their ball, and then he was like, well, I guess you don't want any money then. And the instantaneous flip that they had, where they're like, oh, money, I'm on it, you know, they completely changed their behavior. And I was just like, wow, this is where it starts. I mean, it's not where it starts, but this is, you know, just a deep inculcation of this instinct to obey based on cash incentives, which is wild. But I guess just the fact that that was happening, it was these two little white kids on, you know, on the heart at the, you know, the Heart Lake First Nation during treaty days. But but I think in your example, there was sort of a colonial aspect as well, which I'm curious if you've worked, with a lot of, in a lot of sort of contexts where you would see colonization unfolding, and I'm just curious if you could expand a bit on that. Like, obviously there's capitalism and there's competition, but obviously that's tied up completely in colonialism. So how does that sort of figure into early childhood education? I mean, I think we've already talked about it in the sense of like, like pretending like the like full range of this incredible cultural richness that's potentially there, like right there at your fingertips, like with these childcare workers, is just being ignored. So that's an obvious example, but can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think we essentially call them colonial continuities, right? We're not living really in a post-colonial world. I think I see it, the continual messages, and so you see that a lot in the labor of these women. The hierarchy, and the children really like absorb that deeply, right? That like the brown women are the ones who do the work, and then it's like who has authority in a room and who has authority in a space, and that starts immediately. You usually have not the demographic of worker coming in and doing the inspections, right? And immediately children will know, like, okay, there's someone with authority here. And often it's, there's, we could speak about access to different types of employment and whatever, but that immediately you could feel that. But I think what I will speak to more specifically about colonial continuity is children who need support, and sort of specialists who come in. And if we could talk about early childhood education and the specialists who assess and what we call coding children, is super interesting. So I'll give another concrete example, if I may, a story where I was like, I just sit at too many intersections, so I can like pick up on these things. And so we had at one of our centers that I was working with, we had a relationship with speech path and physiotherapists to come in and be as a resource to families. And often, we have a lot of families who are immigrant families who are working, and daycares really are a hub of information also, and an access point, like somebody outside the family being able to interact with your child and give you a really hopefully grounded, research-based sort of opinion, right, on how to best support them and where they're at. And so we had a speech pathologist come in and assess one of our little girls. And this little girl, I'll speak to, I have a lot of friends who are Somalian, a little Somalian girl, and from what I know and my experience and my relationships, extremely chatty, right? The language is extremely rich, and sort of expressive and all of these things. And so we had a speech path, and so the parent flagged something, whatever. So we had someone come in and watch this little girl and assess her. And I spoke to the woman afterwards, the speech pathologist, sort of saying, oh, like, where are you at with this little girl and whatever. And so the speech path, her assessment was actually mostly based on like colonial stereotypes of, oh, well, these little girls are very quiet, it's in their culture, they just don't whatever. And I I was kind of like just listening really purely to her bias. This is again a woman who is unilingual, she's a speech pathologist, but doesn't understand ESL kids, right, at all. And so constantly assessing children who speak more than one language as deficit in English, because they don't really have the, I would say, skill set to really assess kids who are multilingual. And if they have actual disability, or if it's just, oh, well, they're really fluent in one language, they're catching up in English or whatever. And so a lot of it was like based on stereotypes, and bias of the community group, really. And so I kind of laughed, and I kind of was gentle with this woman, saying, do you think maybe that this child was a bit shy because you're like, you don't look like her mom, you don't look like the staff, like you're kind of a totally new person, like do you think that might have influenced your day. I mean, I think that's a pretty, I'm telling her that's what's happening. And just a complete, but she's the expert, and that there's an authority there. And I think, again, that's a colonial, patronizing worldview. And again, just our communities know this, these experts, quote unquote, coming in and really having maybe a tenth of the worldview needed to kind of understand the entirety of this child. And so, I think that's like, of course, there's colonial sort of continuities in these spaces as microcosms, but then if we look at how do we support kids that maybe need extra support, or have maybe disabilities and that they need these, but then you have also these experts that, have these biases, or maybe just have never been exposed, right, to other cultures, really, and they have grand authority over our children, right, in this way, and their education, their schooling, their trajectory, right, how they're coded is huge, right, and we could talk about that also as a kind of, the way we filter children, right, and funnel them into channels at a very, very early age. I mean, it starts in early childcare, right, it starts preschool, right, so yeah.
Absolutely. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe let's bring it back to the sort of, things that you were emphasizing originally, which is, there's all these layers of material exploitation that are happening, that sort of the downstream effects of which are the stuff that we've just been talking about. But structurally, like, what does it look like to have, I don't know, a more horizontal version of daycare, where the people who do the work are treated as if, in line with reality, which is the fact that they have lots of expertise about what's going on, where these sort of hierarchies are flattened, but also people are paid fairly, and the sort of real estate part is decommodified. Can you paint a picture of what that would look like, and how and I guess the next question would be sort of that I'm anticipating is, how do we get there, obviously?
Yeah, I think the space issue is probably the most urgent matter that progressives need to really look at, the influence of landlords in our childcare spaces. And when we look at fees, are we talking about the labor? Like, are these people getting paid too much, really? Or is it, and I will strongly argue that when you look at the rent, that's a huge part of this issue that's overlooked. But if we sort of take that, so let's say, okay, it's all gravy, and we've worked on that, and we have these public public trusts of childcare spaces, and what do the relation, like the programming and the staff relationship look like? I mean, truly, I've worked in for-profit daycares. I've worked now with non-profit daycares. Everybody, all of us have the same goal, is supporting children in our community and the families, right? But I truly think, and I would love to, do this as a project, or if this is existing somewhere in the country and someone could please get in touch with me, but worker cooperatives. I would really like to see these staff actually being owners, and then they would definitely have, I think a lot of other things would come into play then, if they have that weight of being the owners and being the programmers and sharing in the fruits of their labor, and being able to be properly supported. It's not easy working with 6 toddlers all day long. Like, these women are incredibly just strong, right? Like, in terms of their resilience and all of that. If we could support that through an ownership structure like a cooperative, I think a lot of the other issues would come through, right? So, for example, they would probably be more inclined to bring in their culture and share, their language, and be proud of that, and bring that in, and policies. They would be probably a lot more confident knowing that they have a group, that they're organized, they are an organized collective. And if somebody from the university comes and starts giving beads to children while they're sleeping, they'll probably feel a lot more, they know that they could say no to that, and really make a stand in some of the policies that affect them day to day. So I would love to see, emancipatory worker cooperatives where these women are supported and told that they can organize. And oftentimes, a lot of these women are immigrants, or they don't have, maybe they have PhDs, but they don't and we could talk about sort of Canada as a structure, but they don't know maybe the paperwork aspect, how to organize even their own nonprofit, right? Or how to do the back paperwork side of it. I mean, that's something I support in, and it's a full job, an administrative role, and so really taking the shadowy mist of how to organize our spaces, our workspaces, and really prioritizing, and instead of maybe having boards and nonprofits, that these parents, these families like support worker cooperatives, right? And that it's families and workers maybe that are part of this cooperative, etc. So really taking the administrative and that bureaucratic sort of bubble and having the power with the staff, the workers themselves, and feeling that. I mean, that's how I think it's going to happen. In terms of like, I think that there's a lot of knowledge in, frankly speaking, I think that our current culture individualizes children and really categorizes them, and we see that in childcare policy. And so I think there's a lot of ways of being, specifically by Indigenous women, that I think they have the knowledge. I think if we as racialized women, immigrant women who are doing a lot of this labor, are able to connect to Indigenous women and their, frankly, a way in which we can support, like center the child, really, because that's a lot of the philosophy, is centering the child and having a holistic view. If that bridge could be built and we can really have solidarity built between these demographics, I think that we would see incredible, like varied, rich childcare spaces, with the programming just being incredibly inclusive of elders, of children, of families, of kin, of a much more expansive idea of what childcare is in its totality, right? And that again is a huge gap. I very rarely see those connections, and this is me, where I've been very lucky to work with different community groups, so I maybe am seeing that we're all sort of satellite, and not, that solidarity really needs to be worked on.
So I heard three things there. One is obviously the actual physical space, where childcare happens, and sort of decommodifying that, or creating public spaces, or finding a way to not pay just egregious amounts of rent. The other one is worker ownership, so having the workplace, as well as a significant amount of the policies controlled by the workers themselves. And then sort of, I guess it's sort of a network, more like creating weaving sort of a web of solidarity and I don't know, just childcare like expertise and wisdom, and bringing in different people from different communities to be part of the sort of process of caring for children.
And just that programming spot, just in terms of the solidarity,
right.
just the daily, like going out for walks. What is the worldviews we're bringing into a walk, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Yeah.
And so with those three things, I guess my question would be like, what do you see as the main barriers to achieving each of those?
Or like what,
obviously there's it's a steeplechase of like barriers that you have to get over to get to the end in any one of those cases, but I guess, like, what are the most immediate ones, I guess I would say?
Yeah, I mean, I feel maybe due to my positionality, I think that one barrier that we could address right away is sort of the intellectual elite that are pushing a lot of the we need free childcare, we need universal childcare, but I think there is like an intellectualism behind these campaigns that are often, and I've spoke to a lot of folks, tried to get in there and ask them, how are they grounded in the community, specifically with the labor? How are they grounded to the women, of the racialized women doing the work? Do they know them? How are these projected, these lobbying campaigns that we're doing, to inform the government, the change that's needed, like where is that grounded in the community? And often I have not had fruitful conversations. Typically I'm very much shut down, right? It's sort of, and I think that's again an elitism issue that we have, where there's people writing the policies and with those good intentions, but again, not directly speaking to the staff. And then of course, like, yes, daycares in Alberta, for example, are businesses, but these are racialized women again, and they would be the first ones to tell you, man, we pay too much in rent. It's exploitative, right? Often they were the staff, and then maybe they had the opportunity, 2-3 of them or whatever, through whatever privileges, were able to maybe buy one or be able to own one, and they have a wealth of knowledge as to why they're not able to provide their staff with benefits, why child fees are the way they are, and where are we in, like, where are those conversations happening? I would love to know. And so I'm constantly pushing back on that. I think there's a lot of activists I know that are incredible, and they have children, and they're now working towards these campaign strategies of childcare, which is great. But I need to see these folks who are often white folks, with highly educated white folks, who are just seeing a problem with the fees, but really those relationships are not there. So they're not, I mean, again, it's a bit paternalistic, really, right? That they're gonna come in and write these policies and tell the government, and we've seen with the pandemic, we've seen, like, this is urgent, this is a necessary part of our society. This is, the liberal government has addressed this as childcare being a priority and all these types of things. But like, what are we, I'm like, essentially I'm telling people right now that a majority of those subsidies will go to landlords. So what are we exactly organizing around, and why are we, where are those solidarities, right? And why are we not talking to each other? And I don't know.
I mean, we started this conversation by talking about what this sort of like vast alienating gulf between childcare workers and the people, well, everybody else, really.
Yeah.
But in this case, like, who would it be? Like, is there, I mean, assuming there's not an association of childcare workers, or like a pan-Canadian union, or even a local one. For the most part, I'm guessing that this and then there's this like cultural divide and this sort of racial hierarchy, or racialized hierarchy, and this education hierarchy. All of these things are sort of playing into widening this gulf between, that's really the gulf that's preventing that solidarity between like parents and childcare workers, for example, or I don't know, union activists who have this giant coalition that's really like does a ton of work on childcare, but like ironically, maybe, I'm guessing there's probably not a whole ton of childcare workers on the ground who are part of that. I could be wrong, but from the picture you're painting, it sounds like maybe not. But
from what I know,
yeah. But what would it take on the other side to, like, I mean, I'm guessing those workers, for that to be a systematically, for there to be sort of someone to talk to, I guess, they would have to be organized in some way. But yeah, what are the I guess barriers there that you see?
It's a great question. I mean, I'm like sort of in that middle space, right? I can speak the language of policy, and I've done the work, and I mean, I think the onus truly is on the privileged ones that are benefiting from the labor to really recognize, see the labor, value it, and then maybe you'll have women start to participate in organizing, understand that they're supported. I think that's like the huge issue, is that racialized women know, like, well, we'll just be, if we express any of this, we're going to be fired, right? We're going to be asked to leave. And often these women have very close relationships with these children. They're, they care about these kids. It's not just, it's not a factory to them, but yet we, it's like a factory system enforced on them. But they are extremely risk averse, right? They're already working in a scenario where they're constantly mitigating risk with children and keeping them safe, and keeping these families, like every family has a different demand, and really tightrope walking their community, their microcosm of the community. And so I think really the onus is on us, people like us, who can speak these in these multiple spaces, that can see maybe the larger issue, and our employment isn't threatened, right, by that. And so I would say childcare workers don't feel supported. They feel often that, I don't see them coming in guns a-blazing, being like, yeah, we're all for, you guys are centering childcare, we need childcare. I mean, with the pandemic, like, it was a whisper here, right? No, workers are not organized. In Alberta, you'll see business owners organizing, which is like, late capitalism at its best. It's the ones who benefiting the most of exploiting the labor, and maybe are owning, they own their location, and all that's the biggest expense to them is the labor, and we're constantly trying to minimize that, right? As a good capitalist should.
Yeah.
But so it's, these women just don't feel connected whatsoever. And again, I mean, like, years ago, I campaigned in my community around this, and I ran a campaign, and I went door to door, and I said, like, yo, I'm a teacher, I'm a daycare worker, like, you work in a daycare. And they were extremely like, I don't know, like, we're just, there's a fear of, and to be honest, like, from folks I've talked to who are working on these campaigns, like, I don't see them having the praxis, the real grounded politic of being like, that we can't write policy without these workers. That politic is, maybe I'm wrong, and maybe in different parts of the country it is there, but I'm yet to see that. And these are a lot of my good friends who are amazing activists, organizing in Alberta, who've done incredible work, and have good politics. And again, like, the lack of relationship, the lack of centering the labor, the staff, is just, it's to be desired. It's and I mean, I do my best, like, but I represent an elite class now, and I'm part of that management, and all I can sort of say is encourage staff to organize, and like, tell them of their power, right? Collective power. And I mean, we struggle to do that across the board, right? But
it's really tricky. I think the phrase that really stuck out for me was, we can't make policy without workers at the table. I feel like that's a great way to frame it, because otherwise you get caught up with, like, oh, I'm in this space and I'm advocating for people who aren't here, and I'm like, exactly, I'm a white person and they're all women so I'm speaking for these women of color, but it just gets very weird and awkward. But I feel like there are just little moments like that where you can lay it down, just be like, look, this is common sense, like, we need to create the space for workers to be here, and then that creates like a cascading set of realizations of, like, oh, well, why don't, like, let's offer an honorarium for them to come and, like, spend the day talking to us. And it's like, oh, why doesn't anybody want to come? Oh, maybe it's because they're too, and it creates an educational process on both sides that can actually start to bridge that gap maybe a little bit. But that would, I could even see that being like a decade-long process of, like, building out those realizations and figuring out how to reach across that.
As an educator, when we, activist educator or critical pedagogue, as we say, often a frame or a stance that we could take as an educator is that we center the most vulnerable child. So if we set up our space, for example, for the most vulnerable child in our room, every child benefits. And that's just a basic, I think people would agree with that. So I don't understand why, when we're talking about these childcare campaigns, why we don't recognize that the labor in childcare is the most vulnerable, and that they need to be centered. And whether or not they're coming, if you keep centering them, they will get that picture. And we struggle with this with minority, quote unquote, minority voices, or people that don't speak the language of policy, often get left behind. And so, but if that's our politic as organizers and campaigners around creating healthy spaces, if we center, like, hey, the labor is the most vulnerable in this case, and they are supporting our children who are our priority, and they are the experts. That, it will cascade, right? Like
Mhm.
the workers will feel that. They'll continuously, and it's frustrating. I can see that with a lot of organizers and campaigners. Like I've worked with a lot of union people that are like, we ask, there were a lot of racialized people at the action, but they don't come to our meetings. But it's like, listen, the way you organize your meetings are kind of not so, that's not how we would organize, right? We probably would have a cup of tea, and maybe if we center these workers and ask them how they're comfortable to discuss these issues, maybe not in the way that makes sense to you, in your tradition of how to gather, there might be other ways of gathering that would center them. But if the politic is just, we're centering the labor, we're centering the workers who are caring for our children, as part of these conversations, I think it's a simple politic that I think will get the gears moving very, very quickly. But that commitment is what's needed. And they're used to, I mean, because I'm one of them, right? We're used to being invisible. We're used to being that way. And I think because I was privileged enough that, and these women raised me, right? This is why I'm feeling a lot, like I think a lot of my peers that benefited from, my, families owning a daycare, and like I benefited from their labor, right? That was our bread and butter, and these women raised me. So this is where I feel so strongly about that this is not, I think it's controversial maybe among my peers of like, oh, well, that complicates things. Well, they are the center. They're the heartbeat of, they know your children. They're everything, really. And
Yeah.
it's disingenuous at some degree, really, or just that when we talk about a colonial continuity, it's just that paternalistic, we're going to decide what's best again, and whatever, right? So
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that framing of just centering the workers, in continually is obviously much easier said than done, but it just seems like a really brilliant way to sort of sum it up. I just wanted to back like zoom out again real quick, because I know you've been involved in starting some daycare services for Indigenous kids, and it was, so far we've mostly been talking about all the like extremely complicated and colonial sort of ways that we raise, I don't know, for lack of a better term, mainstream settler kids. But can you talk a little bit about, just from your experience, like providing childcare, whether it's on reserves or outside, and the sort of, I'm just imagining that there are several more layers of like exploitative and colonial dynamics that sort of come into play there, and just wanted to hear more of your experience about that.
Yeah, I just speaking very in broad terms, the isolation and the remoteness creates a dynamic where in the cities, you have this, what some people consider a surplus of labor, right? Oh, people are, you can get people to work, but in some of these communities, they don't have childcare spaces at all. And a lot of that comes down, again, if we're centering the workers and we're centering the labor, daycare workers actually need quite a bit of qualifications. And I'm a teacher, so I've also had a bit of experience teaching English and at the high school level or whatever. And often the situation that I've seen is that it's very tied to the crumbling lack or structural or lack of education and the resources needed in reserve schools, and that support that's needed for the education piece, right? So then often you have women that are doing all the work in these communities. They are absolutely taking care of kids in their community, just so talented, but then they're not eligible for all of the subsidies to get paid a decent wage, right? They're just babysitters, but they're actually the aunties raising all of these children. And why can't they get the salary that they deserve is often because these other educational hoops that we see with Indigenous communities, which is like they're English 30. Well, why don't English 30 hasn't been offered in however many years or whatever, right? There's like all these structural issues at play in the community. And then it has this like domino effect, or this like rotating effect, that you can't get credentialed to be a childcare worker. You can't open a day home because you don't have the courses, and you don't have the courses because you don't have English 30. And how are you going to do English 30 when you're, like all of that structural like barriers to education in general for staff in these spaces is for me like something that's just a huge red flag, right? Like that in and of itself is just something we can like look at immediately. And so, a lot of these programs, for example, they'll have training programs for Indigenous workers, but again, they'll need English 30 at, a 70% pass or whatever. And I'm like, that's kind of just a schooling barrier. Like, these women have done the work, they've demonstrated, they have experience in doing this. We know they can do it. If they're able to just join the diploma program, for example, they can demonstrate the English requirement. Why do they need to go back after 20 years to get a high school credit to be able to do childcare, to get paid for fair childcare? So that, for me, again, centering the staff, that is the most sort of glaring issue I feel is connected to the larger education. Access to information, right?
There's some wild sort of examples. I mean, when I was in Nunavut, I just heard stories about one community that has like 4 different women who have master's degrees in education, and yet they're bringing in a principal who's like some white person from Newfoundland or something, and these are kids who like speak Inuktitut as like their first language, and they're all you need to do is provide just a little extra support to get those people who have like a master's degree in education to like be up to that level. But no, for whatever reason. And then I talk to like public sector workers, and I get the sense that this is sort of the case on a lot of remote areas, but like, public sector workers who, they're talking about their peers here. But they're saying that like the people who come to like work or teach up north are like, what they say, misfits, missionaries, or mercenaries. So basically people are out who are like running away from something, or who are trying to convert people to their religion or whatever, or think they're going to save them, or they're people who are just there to get their like 3rd pension or whatever. And so you end up with this dynamic where like, you have unemployed people who could be supported to be qualified, but even who are qualified and who are being sort of passed over. So anyway, just saying that to say that I think it's a great point of like centering the labor and focusing on those, because it's such a huge difference to have somebody from your community who can provide that service versus like some white person from, who's like fresh out of college from like Edmonton or whatever.
Yep. And I mean, it's arbitrary, right? We're not more intelligent. Cities give you access to things, right? So these people, it's not, and so I don't really understand why exemptions can't be granted, right? Why we can't have a much more dynamic assessment of qualifications in that way. And again, like, as a teacher, I did get to go up north for a couple of years, right? And I have a relationship, and I'm still working with the community up north. And and I was a teacher, and I was invited to go up there. I otherwise wouldn't have, like, so I never would have been exposed to this like culture, this teacher culture, where it's, these teachers come in, they stay in a school to 1 to 2 years and they move on, right? They have so they're completely sort of in these bubbles. They often don't even know like what language is being spoken in the community, even some of the specialists. So when we talk about Jordan's principle and like centering the most vulnerable children as a practice as an educator, like I've seen, for example, just something very small, but a speech pathologist that's coming in and assessing kids that has no experience at all with any Indigenous language, much less understanding the difference between intonation in Cree, Woodland Cree versus Plains Cree versus Blackfoot, which is completely different versus Dene. And often, in these schools, you have Dene speakers, you have Cree speakers, and, and then there's just no frame of reference whatsoever, much less a sense of community, or much less a sense of care for these kids, right? And so, I mean, I have seen local community members, teachers and stuff, they don't want the principal job, they don't want, they're all relatives. And so sometimes, they are, and I find that these communities are so open to outsiders, right? They're very cosmopolitan. For example, they were very interested in me, like, like, what's my background, what's my language, where do they're super cosmopolitan, and they like that there's a bit of like somebody with a bit of distance and has a different set of eyes, and they respect that, and I felt very valued. But you do have exactly that. I mean, I had teachers, my peers, that were straight up like, and this is horrifying, I can't even say it, but just telling me bluntly to my face that residential schools is an excuse, right? And so I'm like, how are you even an educator? Like, that's just, you're so far behind. Like, get over yourself. Like, to even be and then to be employed in a community where you are bullying children, really, and have a complete disregard for society, the society you're in. They're a real issue and a real barrier, right, for that teamwork, for that collective that you otherwise see in the culture, right? And that bubble,
Yeah.
the bubbleness that happens, right?
Well, I guess this is some of the exception to the rule of like centering labor, but it seems like there should be like higher, requirements in terms of like, people who are going to go teach in like a Cree community. Like, you should have a year of Cree at least. I mean,
Right.
like in your university, as part of your university training. And like, why isn't that a thing? Like, it's just totally standard. Like, if you're even thinking about going up there, like, of course you have to take that elective, and that's the pool of people who get to go to those communities. It's not like some rando who like literally doesn't even know the history of residential schools, like.
And we can do this because I know
Yeah.
where I am, like with Catholic schools, if you want to teach in a Catholic school, you have to take this like Catholic elective, right?
Yeah, totally.
And you have to pass it and
exactly
sign some other form saying that you're going to like teach a Catholic education. So why, I mean, that was so, I couldn't even believe that we have educators in these communities. I mean, that's just, again, a colonial continuity, right? It's just continuing because it's the same bias and the same attitude, right? That has been violent and continues to be violent up there. But again, like centering the amazing women, like these Indigenous women raising their kids, raising keeping these communities together, and then much less when we talk about Jordan's principle, right? Ensuring that, again, coming down to the most vulnerable kids in these remote areas, having speech pathologists that might have maybe understand that Crees have particular vowel sounds different than, instead of maybe flagging that as a speech impediment, which is kind of what you see, right? Because there's just no wherewithal, right? So
I was going to wrap it up, but I feel like you just touched on something that I feel like is sort of essential to this whole thing, which I've totally neglected. But just that's the nature of any conversation, is you pick your path, but choose your own adventure. But just the nature of like parenting, and like under capitalism, parenting is seen as like unpaid labor, with some really notable exceptions that have been fought for, like maternity leave, paternity leave, I guess that's pretty much it.
Yeah.
but yeah, that's the list. Thank you, postal workers.
Yes.
But yeah, I guess I just wanted to sort of provide a little section to just talk about that, to talk about we I guess the way I see it is that you're basically, as a society, as an economy, we're saying, okay, well, this is something that people really care about a lot, and I think this happens in a lot of different sectors, and childcare being one of them. People are really intrinsically motivated to care for their children, and so we won't pay them for it. we'll just let them figure it out. Even though they're providing like the fundamental foundation of the entire society, like nobody gets to be a functioning member of society without being parented. And yet that's completely devalued.
Mhm.
Anyway, your thoughts or reactions?
Yeah, I mean, you just actually reminded me of something else that I've seen in terms of attitudes towards daycares or childcare spaces in general. And typically speaking from the government and from other sort of stakeholders, you'll see that daycares are seen as like, they never talk about daycares as an employer or the value of that space as a resource hub for parents, whatever, like essentially a safety net in a lot of communities where people can access research and information to support their children. Oftentimes the attitude and the discourse that you hear is that we need a daycare because the parents need to get to work, right? So oftentimes it's tied to
Yeah, and it's
parents
justified
labor.
economically as a result. Yeah, it's like, oh, it'll add
So
this
it,
much to the economy or whatever. Yeah.
right, and like these parents need to work, like they're sitting at home, raising their children, and yes they want to work, and yes, but really it comes down to like, we need the parents to go to work. And but it's very fascinating because they don't see that the 8 to 10 staff, for example, you'll have at a small daycare, are a highly qualified, that it's an employer of a highly qualified staff base that is supporting the community and that they need to be supported. It's always about like the parents need to get to work, right? Like in Alberta, like the parents need to get to their labor job, you know, in oil and gas or whatever, right? Like they need to be working for the petro companies and whatever. But like childcare labor, like that's not even seen as a profession, which is one huge issue bias that you see right off the bat. But again, it's all tied into parents' labor, getting them back to work, right? So I found that really fascinating. I've like kind of worked around that, and a lot of like government money is not coming from education or community service. All of the like funding comes from like employability, because it's all about getting the parents employment, right? So that's like a really interesting, I mean, I think it just tells you a lot of, it's seen as like you leave your kids there because the parents need to get to work, right? They're not, so much less the childcare professionals are not professionals, they're not labor that's valued, they're not, um, so it just shows you where our investments are going and whatever, and how the government is framing this, like centering childcare, daycares is about getting the
Yeah,
parents, you know,
yeah,
back to work, right?
with profound implications for the future of
Yeah,
our entire society and planet.
exactly. Yeah.
Um, Nav Kaur, thank you so much for joining me on Half Past Capitalism.
Thanks for having me, and thank you for wonderful conversations as always, Drew.
Yeah, cheers. And before we leave off, is there anything you want to plug? Your Twitter, SoundCloud, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, you could join me on Twitter. I'm a lot more polite in person, but it's just Nav North Core on Twitter, and you can kind of follow me. And I prop up sometimes. I do different education projects once in a while, so you could maybe keep track of me through Courage also. So I'll be around there. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks again.
Thank you.